Whether we're looking at Barrows, cromlechs or dolmens, ancient burial sites hold a certain fascination. Folklore about these monuments is often linked to graves, which is right, but the graves are set in the wrong era, such as Vikings, the medieval period, or indeed the Civil War. Sometimes people even believe that giants rested in long barrows, and there are stories that abound of people opening long barrows to find skeletons of men some 8 feet tall. And thanks to their associations with fairies, people considered it bad luck to dig into mounds and barrows. Doing so might bring violent storms or chronic illness and bad luck. So what other kind of folklore is attached to these kind of sites? Let's find out in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host, Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there, and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. I do hope that you are well. We are continuing with folklore of sacred spaces in the landscape, although, to be pretty honest, like a lot of the sites that I've been finding, apart from holy wells, haven't necessarily felt that sacred, but there we go. We did stone circles last week, and this time we're moving on to barrows and all that kind of thing. And for simplicity's sake, I have grouped together barrows, dolmens and chamber tombs because this is a folklore podcast, not an archaeology one. And I'm obviously just more interested in the legends attached to these kind of prehistoric grave sites. As ever, as I said in the Standing Stones episode, big thanks to Jez Hunt from Ancestor Leathercraft for helping me out with all of this kind of stuff and basically walking me through how all this stuff works. I also realised I'd been completely forgetting to do my "this episode is sponsored by" thing, which I'd been doing with the Victorian language of flowers. So I'm going to do one now because I think this one's absolutely brilliant. And this is current. And if you send that, apparently it meant "thy frown will kill me." And I'm kind of like, what is that if not a really antiquated Victorian way of kind of going, can you not just smile? And I just thought that was quite funny for all the wrong reasons. But there we go. Current is sponsoring this week's episode. We are just going to jump into these different barrows and whatnot. We've got quite a few from Wilshire. We've also got one from Wales, there's one from Ireland, and there's one from Brittany as well. So we're going into Europe this time, as well as the various ones around England. And we're going to start off with Clay Hill in Wiltshire. And you actually find the remains of a prehistoric hill fort and 2 round barrows at the top of Clay Hill. And local writer V.S. Manley wrote in 1924 that a benevolent spirit lived in one of the barrows. Even better, said spirit appointed himself the guardian of a nearby hamlet and showed them where to find a well with the power to cure eye ailments. As Jennifer Westwood and Jacqueline Simpson point out, this story isn't necessarily odd for the idea of a helpful fairy in a mound, because obviously there's a whole litany of stories about fairies and mounds, but fairies aren't necessarily always linked with healing wells. I mean, they can be linked with wishing wells, yes, but not so much healing wells, so that's quite an interesting one. But the hill itself was believed to be created by the devil. And you do know how much I love my stories of the devil doing something to make something in the landscape. It's absolutely brilliant as a story motif. But essentially, the devil had decided to cover Devizes in dirt after it became more Christian than the devil was happy with. So while he was on the way to Devizes, he stopped an old man on the road to ask how far Devizes actually was. And in this kind of instance, it makes me think that the devil was essentially going, "Oh, we're there yet," which just makes it even funnier. But anyway, the old man realised that this was the devil and realised he was up to no good, as the devil usually isn't, and claimed that he didn't know how far Devizes was. But he did point out that his beard had been black when he set off for Devizes and now it was grey. The devil obviously realised that it was just far too far to get to Devizes and he wasn't going to bother, so he just dumped the pile of dirt on the spot. And lo, Clay Hill was born. That's not really got anything to do with the barrows, I just thought it was cool, so that's why I thought I'd put that one in, and thank you to Emma Hurd at Weird Wiltshire for her blog for supplying that one. We're going to move on to West Kennet Long Barrow. And this very famous barrow lies just over a mile from Avery and dates to somewhere between 3600 BC and 3700 BC. And while we are more interested in the folklore of the site, I did want to note a somewhat grisly aspect of the site's history, because in the 17th century, a local doctor joined the hill diggers who were plundering the site. And his target was human bones because he was grinding them up to make medicine. So we quite rightly pillory the Victorians for grinding up mummies to make all kinds of things from paint to, again, medicines. But here we have the 17th century a doctor doing the exact same thing to British remains. So basically, people in the past got a lot to answer for. Anyway, the barrow is also said to be haunted, and according to local farmers, a man in white robes apparently stands on the mound with a large white dog with red ears at dawn on the summer solstice. That's the dog has red ears, not the man. And they stand at the eastern end of the barrow, and then at sunrise they turn and go into the barrow. Now, some reports do seem a little confused because some of them say that he does this on the summer solstice, other ones say it's Midsummer Eve or Midsummer Day. And remember, Midsummer Day is actually the 24th of June because it's one of the old quarter days, so it's a fixed date in the calendar. Whereas the summer solstice date can change because it's an astronomical event, so obviously it's not the same every year. It's around the same time, but not literally a calendar date that you can point to and say it's always going to be that. Now, I can't help thinking that if the figure is a ghostly druid, as it has been described, then he'd be far more likely to observe the solstice than Midsummer Day, particularly given Midsummer Day was instituted so much longer after the druids. But what actually fascinates me here is the description of the dog. White with red ears? That sounds a lot like descriptions of the Cwn Annwn, the spectral dogs of Annwn in Welsh folklore. Now, they're normally linked with the other world, or they're seen as a death portent, so it does rather beg the question why one would then be seen beside a barrow on the summer solstice in Wilshire. Other people have also reported intense dread inside the barrow, and others have seen figures or heard whispering. And in 1995, one witness actually heard a high-pitched sound before a Neolithic man came out of the barrow. Not 100% sure how he knew he was Neolithic, because that was just a small snippet on the paranormal database, but there we go. And in 1992, a couple visiting the barrow reported a somewhat harrowing experience, or at least the woman did, because she went inside the barrow while her partner remained outside. She reported feeling invisible hands grabbing her and pulling her towards the furthest part of the tomb. After managing to break free, she ran outside where she told her partner what had happened. Now, she did say that the whole incident only lasted a few minutes, but she reported that it felt like hours. Now, what's particularly odd is that in 1996, a witness reported going into the barrow, and then they said that they felt like they'd walked into an invisible wall and some kind of force tried to push them out of the barrow. So it does make you wonder why invisible forces would try and drag one person in and then push another one out. And it's also quite interesting that all these things are happening in the 90s, and there doesn't really seem to be anything more recent than that. So if you've been in West Kennet Long Barrow after 1996 and something bizarre has happened to you, please do feel free to let me know, because it would be cool to know if there was some kind of time limit on this kind of thing, or if indeed it is still happening. And we're going to stay in Wiltshire for Byfield Down, or at least the dolmen there, which is a large prehistoric chamber tomb that's been nicknamed the Devil's Den. So yes, the devil's back in this one. And a 19th and early 20th century tradition claimed that no horses or oxen could actually haul away the capstone. And indeed, if you poured water into various hollows on the capstone, then a demon would come to drink it during the night. Some versions of the story say you've got to put the water in particular hollows, other ones aren't quite as specific, but I would like to point out that water does have a tendency of disappearing of its own accord, because it's called evaporation. So, who knows? That said, a later story claims that the devil appears at midnight with 4 white oxen and tries to remove the capstone. He never manages to achieve this, but a white dog with burning eyes watches him from within the tomb. Now, I'd be fascinated to know if that white dog also has red ears as well. But the story doesn't explain why the devil's trying to destroy the dolmen. It just says that he does. And it also doesn't say if he does this every midnight or if it's midnight on a specific day. Again, it's a little bit vague, which is a shame, because I'd just love to know what his end game is with that one. But as with all of these things, other variations of the story do exist. In some of them, the devil tries to destroy the dolmen with 8 white oxen. And in this one, a white hare arrives to offer advice. And in another version, the dog that's watching the devil is a black hound, not a white one. So there's quite a lot of different versions of that. They all kind of have the same thing running through them, which I think is quite interesting. But the fundamental question for me is, why is the devil trying to destroy it? And it just doesn't make sense to me. But there we go. And Wiltshire barrows also aren't just linked with the devil or ghostly figures either, lest that be the lesson that you take away from this. Because according to one legend, a barrow at Chiseldon in Wiltshire apparently contained a golden coffin, and any attempts to take it from the barrow would fail. That's as much as it said on the paranormal database about that one. And again, you do have to think, where exactly were they going with this? But golden artefacts inside barrows does lead us on to our next example, which is in East Yorkshire, and that's the Willie Howe site between Wold Newton and Burton Fleming. Now, there are actually 3 barrows on the Willie Howe site, but most people just count them together. Now, locals believe that the round barrow was actually a fairy home, and a drunken villager stumbled home one night and heard singing on the way. Being quite curious, because he was also quite full of drink, he wandered in the direction of the music and was quite surprised to see a door open in the side of the mound. And inside he could see a banquet in progress. So obviously people are laughing, they're drinking, they're having a jolly good time. And eventually someone noticed him standing outside and actually came out. Far from trying to get him to clear off, as you might imagine, they actually offered him a cup. Now, despite his drunken state, the villager knew enough of fairies not to accept food or drink from them, so he threw away the drink. Yet he also ran off with the cup, whose material somewhat confused those who saw it. Canon William of Newburgh described it as, and I quote, "a vessel of an unknown material, unusual colour and strange form," end quote, and it actually ended up in the possession of Henry I before it went to Scotland for a time. Yes, that's the same William of Newburgh who wrote about vampires in the north of England. He also came from the Willie Howe area, so he would have been familiar with the site. The cup does somehow end up in the possession of Henry II, and then from that point we don't really know what happened to it or where it went, which is a shame because it would be quite cool to see something like that. But the fact that William just drops it in the middle of his discussion, in much the same way that he's just suddenly randomly talks about vampires, makes you think that either A, there must have been some kind of local tradition for fairies in the area, but B, the idea that they just used to give away bits of their tableware as well. I don't suppose they were necessarily expecting people to run off with it either, but there we go. Another fairy story linked to the site actually saw a fairy woman tell a local man to go to the top of the barrow every morning. There he would find a guinea, but on one condition. He had to keep the arrangement secret. So the man did so, going up to the barrow every morning and collecting his guinea. But as people always do in these stories, he eventually told a friend about the promise. So once he'd broken his word to keep silent, the guinea disappeared and the whole group of fairies punished him, although the story is scant as to how they did that. And it's also unclear what the fairy woman got from the deal. I'm not quite sure why she would be giving him a guinea, and I'm assuming that the guinea remained a guinea and didn't sort of turn to fairy gold once he got home, i.e. turn to leaves. So it's a bit of an odd one, that one. But again, it does just sort of feed into that narrative about Willie Howe being associated with fairies. Now, according to another legend, people dug into the mound and found a golden chest in it. Horses actually couldn't pull it free, which links back to that idea of oxen and horses not being able to actually remove the capstone from these monuments. But eventually the golden chest disappeared back into the mound. Now, it would be easy to assume that this referred to treasure found at the barrow, yet excavations have yet to find any evidence of burials on the site. So why would anyone link golden items to an empty barrow? Did the story simply accrue around these sites over time? Now, I did actually find a PhD thesis by Lily Hawker Yates about the barrows in medieval imagination, and she notes that the association between barrows and buried treasure actually appears in early medieval texts, including Beowulf. And she also points out that while it's unlikely everyday folk were aware of these texts, treasure was found in the barrows, which helped the association to continue. And she also points out that ordinary people would have come into contact with the barrows more often through farming activities, again perpetuating the link between barrows and their contents. So it is entirely likely that people would have come across archaeological finds and then led them to think that there must be treasure in the barrows, and therefore the stories continue. So those ones, in a weird kind of way, do have a bit of a grain of truth to them. It's just who the treasure belongs to ends up being ascribed a little bit wrongly. But we're going to head off to France now for La Roche-au-Fay, which I've probably pronounced horribly badly, but you know me in French, doesn't really get on. And I briefly mentioned this spectacular Neolithic gallery grave back in the Stone Circles episode, and you can find La Roche-au-Fay in Essay in Brittany, and it's actually the biggest dolmen in France. Some 20 metres long, its entrance aligns with the winter solstice sunrise, and the sun lights up the interior of the tomb. Now, its name actually translates to the Fairies Rock, which comes from a legend that fairies built the dolmen, because the stones are several tons each and came from a source some 5 kilometres away, so people assumed that only supernatural powers could have brought the stones to the site. And one legend goes a little bit further and claims that fairies actually carried the stones to the site in their aprons, which makes you think these must have been massive fairies with massive aprons considering the size of them. But they then dropped them on the spot in a single night to prove to humans that they existed. So as a way of kind of throwing down your trump card and going, you see, we do exist, it's quite a spectacular one, to be honest. But it's quite interesting because there is an idea of this countless stones that you get with stone circles, which I mentioned last week, where people can never come to the same number twice. And it seems that the same thing can actually apply to dolmens, because according to one fable, the number of slabs that makes up this gallery grave varies between 40 and 42, depending on who's counting. And as a result, it's actually become attached to a love divination. And we all know how much I love my love divinations here at Fabulous Folklore. So if a couple wants to know if their relationship will last, they can actually use this dolmen to find out. So each partner should walk around the tomb in opposite directions, counting the stones. And if they get the same number, when they sort of come back together and meet up again, then the future looks bright. I'm going to assume that they actually mark the first one so that they both end up counting from the same point, but I just thought that was pretty cool and really unusual because that one didn't really pop up with any of the other ones that I'd come across. Granted, I couldn't cover every single mound with folklore attached to it, so there will be somebody going, oh, why haven't you included this one? Why haven't you included that one? First of all, these episodes are not an hour long, so running time is an issue. But I also do quite like to try and find different types of stories as well. And speaking of which, we're going to go on to the Tinkin Wood burial chamber in South Glamorgan. And this one's Neolithic and lies south of St Nicholas. And this one's quite a cool one because it mixes like Barrow folklore with stone circle folklore, because it's got stones around the monument which are said to be women who'd been dancing around it on a Sunday. So obviously that's the familiar story motif that we looked at last week. And an earlier name for the site was actually Castle Carrigan, or Witch's Castle, which then apparently refers to these women. But where the other monuments feature fairies, treasure or ghostly figures, Tinkin Wood actually goes in a completely different direction, because here people believed it was dangerous to sleep inside the tomb on one of the 3 spirit nights. If they did so, they might go mad, die or become a poet, which I think is quite an interesting set of 3 almost curses, like going mad and dying I can see as being a bad thing, but I'm not necessarily sure why becoming a poet is considered such a bad thing. But the nights in question for these 3 spirit nights in Welsh folklore are Nos Galan Haf, which is April 30th, Nos Gwilafan, which is June 23rd, and Nos Galan Gaeaf, which is October 31st. And you might recognise those dates as May Eve, Midsummer Eve and All Hallows Eve respectively. Now, Marie Trevelyan also says that the ghosts of druids haunted the stones and they would beat wicked people as punishment. So one man who was described as fond of drink fell asleep at the monument, and the next day he claimed that the druids had beaten him, then thrown him up into the sky, keeping him suspended there until sunrise when he plummeted into the woods. He clearly lived to tell the tale, but there's no obvious reason for druids to haunt a Neolithic monument, much less punish people who slept there. And I would also say, how much can we necessarily take the word of somebody who is, as the story says, fond of drink and clearly is a little bit the worse for wear? So we do have to wonder. But we're going to finish off with New Grange, and I couldn't do this episode and not include it. And also it was a request as well, so I wanted to put this one in because somebody did actually ask for it. And New Grange is in County Meath in Ireland, and it's quite frankly probably the most astonishing. In fact, it is the most astonishing of all the ones featured in this episode. Again, it's Neolithic, it's a passage tomb, and it's also older than both the pyramids and Stonehenge, which just makes it even cooler again. If it needed anything else to make it cooler, a roof box in the grave actually allows sunlight to flood the space on the winter solstice at sunrise. Now, I should point out that the light actually enters a few minutes after sunrise now, but obviously that's thanks to precession, which is essentially the wobble of the Earth's axis. So 5,000 years ago, the light would have entered exactly at sunrise, and I just love that level of engineering. But New Grange does appear in Irish stories as the home of Angus Oweg, the son of the Dagda and Boann, the goddess of the river Boyne, which sort of flows right next to it. Now, given Boann was actually married at the time, the Dagda sent her husband away on an errand and then stopped time so that 9 months passed in an instant. Boann then gave birth to Angus on the day he was conceived, and he was fostered until he was 9 when another child told him that his father wasn't actually his real father, prompting him to go and find out who was. By the time Angus had caught up with the Dagda, he'd already divided up the she-mounds among the Tuatha De Danann. Now Angus asked his father if he could spend a day and a night in New Grange, which was the Dagda's home. Now the Dagda actually agreed, probably thinking that that was a fair enough thing to do, except when Angus's time in New Grange was up, he then told the Dagda that because night and day were the same as the whole world, that the Dagda had essentially given him the whole world in giving him a day and a night in New Grange, and therefore more or less kept it for himself, which is quite interesting. I do highly recommend the work of Laura O'Brien if you want to know more about Irish mythology, and you can check out her Irish Pagan School for more resources, and the link is below. But Newgrange also appears in other stories as Cuchulain's birthplace, and I think one of the reasons why we've got all these fabulous stories about the mythology and then it sort of jumps forward a bit is because local farmers actually rediscovered Newgrange in 1699, but it wasn't actually excavated until 1962. But it does play this really, really sort of major role in Irish mythology as sort of, I think it's described in some of the sources as the Palace of the Gods, and it does look absolutely spectacular. So if you have been to Newgrange, please do let me know. But ultimately, what do we make of the folklore of Barrows? Well, the folklore is a lot more varied than that of stone circles, because just among these examples alone, we've got the barrows built by fairies, we've got barrows lived in by fairies, we've got them created or intended for destruction by the devil, we've got them full of treasure, being the home of gods, or haunted by mysterious figures. Now, the links to the Druids are perhaps inevitable, but let's be honest, there is also something otherworldly about barrows. Being spaces for the dead, they're not exactly meant for the living. As tombs, they're far less mysterious than stone circles, because we might not necessarily understand the burial rites of our forebears, but we at least recognise the desire to inter members of the community, which obviously with stone circles, because we don't really know what they're for, we don't have that same level of certainty. But I think the visual difference of these tombs from later graveyards means that they weren't always recognised as tombs when they were first discovered. Folklore helps to fill in the gaps until archaeology can come along and provide more answers. That being said, I'm not sure I'd fancy sleeping in Tinkin Wood on Midsummer's Eve. So, which is your favourite dolmen or barrow? I know it might seem like a really weird question, but I know at least one person who will have one, who I dare say will probably be listening. So please do feel free to let me know as always. Apologies if I didn't include your favourite barrow. Don't forget, there's a very good chance I'll come back and revisit a lot of these topics again. So if I haven't covered something the first time, there's loads left for us to have a look at the next time. So there's always that. Next week, we're going to have a look at hill figures, and I'm already starting to get a little bit concerned that there's perhaps not as much as I might have liked. So I might have to expand that out to labyrinths as well, but we shall see. We'll see how that goes. And just as a reminder as well, on April 1st, this is not an April Fool, it's like a legitimate thing. At 6 p.m, I'm doing a talk with Cresswell Craggs on the folklore of April Fool's Day. We're going to have a look at the folklore behind some pranks and also kind of games as part of children's folklore as well. So if you're free, it would be marvellous to spend a little bit of time with you doing that. Otherwise, I will see you soon, and I hope that you have a marvellous week ahead. Cheerio. Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record and edit these episodes, so if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee, or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits, including exclusive episodes and articles and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below, and thanks in advance.